It was a night like any other, until I felt the cold metal glint of a knife just inches from my face. I never thought I'd find myself staring down the barrel of danger at a gas station, but there I was, trembling and completely frozen in fear. This is I had two choices: stop at the gas station just a block away, which had become a hotspot for sketchy characters, or risk running out of gas on the way home. I didn't want to get stuck, so I reluctantly headed to the station near my work, knowing I'd have to deal with the unsettling atmosphere. When I arrived, the lot was surprisingly empty. I let out a small sigh of relief, thinking I could fill up without any hassle. I stepped out of my car, swiped my card at the pump, but it was useless. The reader wouldn't work. Frustrated but determined, I headed inside to prepay for $20 of gas. I mentioned the broken card reader to the attendant, but he just shrugged, uninterested in my plight. I brushed it off and went back outside. That's when I noticed another car pull up right behind mine. The station had only 2 pumps, which meant we were practically on top of each other. I tried to ignore the newcomers as I unscrewed my gas cap, just wanting to finish up quickly. Then, the yelling started. At first I thought it was just another argument that would fizzle out, but the voices only grew louder. A man was screaming at another about money and debts, and soon a woman joined in, shouting about how they would pay him back. I kept my head down, pretending not to hear them, but my heart raced. Suddenly the car doors slammed and I saw them get out, still arguing. One of them started fiddling with the pump, clearly facing the same issue I had. Against my better judgment, I leaned over and said, "Hey, the readers are broken. You need to pay inside." The guy at the pump turned, his face softening for a moment as he muttered a thanks and walked toward the building. But the man who stayed behind, the one who had been yelling, stared at me with wild eyes. My stomach twisted as I sensed the shift in the air. "Who do you think you are?" he hissed, his voice low but dripping with anger. I stammered, trying to explain I was just trying to help, but before I could finish, he stepped closer and pulled out a small knife. My heart sank. "I should mess you up right here," he snarled, holding the blade toward me. "You think you can just butt in? I'll make you regret that." I froze, fear wrapping around me like a vice. The knife was so close now, gleaming ominously in the dim light of the station. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears, sweat trickling down my back. I raised my hands slowly, trying to calm the storm brewing between us, but there was no escape. Before I could even think of what to say, the first guy, the one I had spoken to, burst out of the station. His eyes widened at the sight of the knife. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted, glaring at the man with the blade. It felt like time stood still as the tension escalated, the air thick with threat. The guy with the knife didn't back down, but the other man stepped forward, reaching into his waistband. What I saw next shocked me, a glimpse of a gun. He didn't pull it out completely, but it was enough to make the guy with the knife hesitate. "Drop it before I drop you," the first guy warned, his voice hard. They stared each other down, and for a moment I thought my life might end right there. Finally, the knife lowered, and the man backed away, climbing back into the car, still shouting about how he would find me, and this wasn't over. I was shaking so badly I could hardly stand. My body felt weak, and all I wanted was to escape. The first guy turned to me, his tone softening. "I'm sorry about him. He's dealing with some stuff. Just finish up and go. Maybe don't mention this to anyone for your own safety, okay?" I nodded, unable to find my voice. I hurriedly finished pumping gas, not daring to glance over at the car again. As I drove away, the scene replayed in my mind over and over. Even though I walked away unharmed, the fear clung to me like a shadow. The way that man looked at me, the knife so close to my skin. I never returned to that gas station. Now, I fill my tank long before it runs low, trusting my instincts. Sometimes, the real horrors aren't monsters or ghosts. They're the chilling reminders of how fragile safety can be. What if the gas station you stopped at was never really there? It was late, and Jenna, a college student, could barely keep her eyes open after a long night of studying. Driving through a deserted stretch of highway, all she wanted was to be home. But then her fuel light blinked on. Empty. She sighed, hoping she'd find a gas station soon. The road was dark, silent, and endless. Just as her hope was fading, she spotted something ahead. A dimly lit, old-fashioned gas station with a flickering sign that read, "Joe's Garage." It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, but the lights were on. Jenna hesitated, but with no other options, she pulled in. The place was straight out of a different era. Rusty pumps stood frozen in time, their paint chipped and peeling. The garage was old, its large, rusty doors half closed, windows caked with dust. Everything about the station felt off, but Jenna was too tired to care. She began filling her tank. As the fuel pumped, Jenna noticed movement inside the garage. A man was hunched over a workbench, his face hidden under a greasy cap. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though time didn't matter. Jenna waved at him, but he never looked up. The only sounds were the steady hum of the pump and the faint clinks of tools. Jenna's nerves began to creep up on her, but she brushed them aside, eager to be done. With her tank full, she walked toward the garage to pay. "Excuse me?" she called out, but the man didn't move. She cleared her throat. "Hello? How much do I owe you?" was gone, like it had never been there at all. Jenna's chest tightened as a cold breeze swept through. Her phone had no signal. The darkness around her felt suffocating. A passing car stopped to help. When Jenna reached the nearest town, she told the locals about Joe's garage. They stared at her with wide eyes and whispered among themselves. "That place has been closed for years," one of them said. "People say it's haunted. Some claim it's a gateway to somewhere else." Jenna never spoke of that night again, but the memory haunted her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed into a place that wasn't part of this world. A place where time, space, and reality twisted into something wrong. Why do shadows follow you when you're running from something you can't see? Late one snowy evening in Cedar Hollow, Mr. Parker, the gruff but reliable owner of Parker's Pit Stop, was closing up his gas station when an old battered sedan pulled into the lot. The roads were silent, buried under fresh snow, and the storm was intensifying by the minute. The man hesitated, his voice dropping to a nervous whisper. "I don't know if it's real or if I'm losing it, but something's been following me. I keep seeing these shadows. They're everywhere, in the mirror, on the road behind me." He swallowed hard. "I just need to get away." Parker frowned, feeling a chill that wasn't just from the cold. Before he could respond, the temperature plummeted sharply, and a sudden gust of wind howled through the station. It felt as if the night itself had come alive. Snow whipped through the air, and the man's eyes grew wide with panic. The gas finished pumping, and the man paid quickly, his hands trembling. "Thanks again," he muttered, already rushing back to his car. The engine roared to life, and he sped off into the storm, disappearing into the white abyss. Mr. Parker looked up, but something gnawed at him. Just as he was turning off the lights, a loud thud echoed from the direction of the pumps. His heart raced. He stepped outside, and there, in the dim light, stood a dark figure, still and silent, shrouded in shadow. It was too dark to make out any details, but Mr. Parker knew it wasn't right. His instincts screamed at him to get inside. "Hello," he called, his voice trembling slightly. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. He hurried back inside, locking the door tight, his skin prickling with dread. The night dragged on. The storm outside raged, snow piling high against the windows. The next morning, when the storm finally cleared, the sheriff came by with more disturbing news. The sedan had been found, abandoned, and worse, locals had been reporting strange sightings for days before. Shadowy figures lurking just beyond the edges of light, whispers on the wind. Mr. Parker shuddered, remembering the figure by the pump and the man's desperate eyes. In the weeks that followed, Parker's pit stop became the talk of the town. People began reporting eerie occurrences. Customers spoke of seeing shadows that moved when no one else was there. Some claimed to see the silhouette of a man pacing near the pumps, mirroring the last customer's frantic movements. Mr. Parker, disturbed and exhausted, eventually sold the station and retired, but the stories didn't stop. The new owners faced their own share of unsettling events. Shadowy figures watching from the dark corners, strange noises late at night, and the overwhelming feeling that someone or something was always watching. Cedar Hollow's gas station soon became a legend, a warning to travelers passing through. Beware the shadows on the road, they're not always just in your mind. Was it the cold that sent chills down her spine, or was it the shadowy figure lurking in the gas station? Samantha loved adventure, especially exploring remote places. One crisp winter evening, she found herself driving through an isolated area, her car's headlights barely piercing the thick darkness. Her fuel gauge was dangerously low, and a knot of anxiety formed in her stomach as she desperately searched for a gas station. After what felt like hours of driving, she spotted a dimly lit sign that read, "Miller's Stop." The small, rundown gas station looked as if it hadn't been touched in years, but with her tank almost empty, it was her only option. As she pulled in, an unsettling chill swept through the air, much colder than the surrounding night. The silence was thick, broken only by the soft crunch of snow beneath her tires. She parked beside the ancient pumps, their faded screens and rusted nozzles a stark reminder of the station's decay. While refueling, Samantha noticed movement in the shadows of the station's office. A woman stood inside, dressed in an old-fashioned uniform, her face hidden behind a thick veil. She didn't move or acknowledge Samantha, but the woman's presence sent a shiver down her spine. What was she doing here? After filling her tank, Samantha approached the office to pay. The woman remained silent, staring blankly ahead. "Hello?" The woman whispered, handing Samantha a faded receipt. Confused but relieved to be on her way, Samantha hurried back to her car, her heart pounding. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror and watched Miller's Stop fade into the darkness. But unease gripped her. It felt as if something was following her. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and suddenly her headlights flickered before dying completely. Panic rose as she pulled over to check her phone, but there was no signal. The only sound was the howling wind and the distant echo of what seemed like a woman's voice. Heart racing, she tried to restart the engine, but it sputtered and fell silent. With no other choice, she stepped outside. but Miller's stop was gone, swallowed by the darkness and swirling snow. Gritting her teeth against the cold, she began walking back the way she had come. Each crunch of snow beneath her boots was mirrored by footsteps behind her. When she turned, nothing was there. The feeling of being watched intensified, making her skin crawl. After what felt like hours, she spotted a warm glow in the distance. A house. She hurried to the door and knocked, relief flooding her as a kind elderly couple let her in. They offered her warmth and food as she recounted her strange experience. Their faces turned solemn as they listened. Miller's stop has been closed for decades, the husband said, his voice low. People say it's haunted by a woman who disappeared there. Her spirit is trapped, wandering the station, waiting for the next traveler. Samantha's heart sank. She left the couple's home the next morning, shaken to her core. What had she encountered? As she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the echoes of midnight were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to stumble into their grasp. What if the friendly face at the gas station you trust was hiding a terrifying secret? It was a quiet summer night when Mark, a weary truck driver, pulled into a small rural gas station known as Willow's Way. The old establishment had a worn-out sign and faded paint, but the neat rows of vintage gas pumps and the quaint little store seemed inviting enough. Mark welcomed the chance to stretch his legs after a long day of driving. As he filled up his truck, he noticed the lone attendant, a young woman with a friendly smile, working diligently behind the counter. Her bright demeanor stood out in the otherwise deserted area. "Evening," Mark said, trying to strike up a conversation. "Evening," she replied cheerfully. "Just finishing up a few things." Mark appreciated her warmth and went inside to pay. The store was filled with old-fashioned knickknacks and snacks, creating a nostalgic atmosphere. The attendant moved quickly and efficiently, ringing up his purchase. "Thanks for stopping by," she said, her smile unwavering. "Not many folks come through this way." Mark nodded, grabbing a couple of snacks for the road. Just as he was about to leave, he noticed something odd. The attendant was fidgeting, glancing nervously toward the back of the store. "Everything okay?" he asked, his concern growing. The smile faltered slightly. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just a little weird tonight." Mark shrugged it off and headed back to his truck. But as he prepared to start the engine, he caught a glimpse of the attendant through the window. She stood by the back door, her anxious eyes staring into the darkness beyond the station. Curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to investigate. He walked back to the store and tried to open the door, but it was locked. He knocked, but the attendant didn't respond. After a moment, he noticed her slipping out of the back door, disappearing into the night. Unease washed over him. Why was she leaving? He waited, but she didn't return. Growing concerned, he went inside the store. To his shock, it was empty. The familiar sounds of the gas station were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. Feeling a knot of dread in his stomach, Mark decided it was time to leave. As he drove away, he glanced back at the gas station. There in the window stood the attendant, her face pressed against the glass. Her eyes were wide with fear, filled with a desperation that sent chills down his spine. The next morning, Mark heard unsettling news on the radio. Willow's Way had been abandoned for years. and locals spoke of strange occurrences and mysterious disappearances. Stories of a vanishing attendant surfaced, with her image captured in old photographs, always showing a fearful expression. That unsettling night lingered in Mark's mind, a haunting reminder that not everything is as it seems. The image of the attendant's desperate face haunted him, a chilling symbol of the darkness hidden behind familiar smiles. What if the help you seek is just an illusion, and the past refuses to let you go? In the middle of a long, deserted highway, an old toll booth stood silently, abandoned for years. It was a relic of a time when the road was busy and bustling with life. Travelers often spoke of the eerie feeling they got when passing by. But it wasn't until Sarah found herself stranded that she experienced the terror firsthand. Driving cross-country, Sarah's car suddenly broke down on this desolate stretch of highway. The nearest town was miles away, and with no cell signal, she had no choice but to find help. As she walked, she spotted the old toll booth in the distance. Its faded sign was barely readable, but something about it seemed oddly inviting. As she approached, Sarah noticed that the toll booth was surprisingly well kept for its age. The windows were clean, and the old cash register inside gleamed as if polished just that morning. A note on the door, written in elegant script, read, "Please ring the bell for assistance." With a mix of curiosity and hesitation, she rang the bell. Moments later, a middle-aged man in an old-fashioned uniform appeared at the window. His face was mostly hidden by a cap, and his expression was solemn, as if he were a statue come to life. "Need help?" he asked in a flat tone. Sarah explained her situation, and the man nodded but didn't immediately offer assistance. Instead, he watched her with a vacant stare, sending chills down her spine. "I'll need to check your car," he finally said before disappearing into the booth. Sarah hesitated, her anxiety growing, but she followed him inside. The toll booth was filled with old maps, dusty books, and vintage toll tokens, remnants of a time long past. As she waited, a strange chill enveloped her. The man reappeared after a few minutes, his expression unchanged. "I'll get someone to help you," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the small space. Time dragged on, each passing minute heavy with silence. Growing impatient, Sarah decided to leave and head back to her car, but as she stepped outside, her heart dropped. The toll booth had changed. It looked older, more dilapidated, as if it had aged overnight. The once polished cash register now appeared covered in dust, and the windows were grimy. "Hello?" she called, but the man was nowhere to be seen. The bell on the door was silent, and a thick tension filled the air, making her skin crawl. Sarah rushed back to her car, desperation fueling her movements. But when she turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. Panic surged through her as she sat in the growing darkness, waiting for help that never came. Hours passed before a passerby finally stopped and offered assistance. But when they approached the toll booth, both were bewildered to find it had transformed into a crumbling ruin, barely recognizable from the structure Sarah had approached just hours before. In disbelief, Sarah finally made it back to town, her heart racing. When she asked the locals about the toll booth, they exchanged uneasy glances. They told her it had been abandoned for years, whispering of a ghostly attendant who appeared to lost travelers but never offered real help. Sarah never drove that stretch of highway again. The memory of the lonely toll booth and its spectral attendant haunted her, a chilling reminder that sometimes Help is just a ghost of what it once was. Tom was a truck driver with over 20 years on the road, convinced he had seen everything, until one fateful night at a gas station off the beaten path. Harper's Haven was a small, isolated stop that looked neglected and forgotten. The pumps were old, and the entire place felt eerie, with an unsettling quiet that hung in the air like a thick fog. A flickering bulb above the pumps cast ghostly shadows, making Tom's skin prickle. Running low on fuel, Tom approached the station, thinking it must be closed for the night. But just as he began filling up, an elderly man emerged from the darkness. He wore a tattered uniform and had a face that seemed carved by time. The man said nothing, merely nodding at Tom, who nodded back, slightly unnerved. Once he finished pumping gas, Tom walked inside to pay. The man stood behind the counter, his eyes obscured by a cap. Without a word, he handed Tom a crumpled receipt. Tom squinted at it, noticing there was no price, only a series of strange symbols and numbers that seemed to twist and turn in the dim light. "Is this all?" Tom asked, but the man didn't answer. He just gestured toward the door with an unsettling calmness. Confused and slightly disturbed, Tom left the station, feeling as though something was terribly off. As he drove away, Tom glanced down at the receipt, trying to make sense of the symbols. They reminded him of ancient hieroglyphs, forming a pattern he couldn't decipher. He pushed the thought aside, dismissing it as just an oddity from an old, forgotten place. But later that night, his truck began to sputter and lose power. Alarmed, Tom pulled over, hoping it was just a minor issue. Yet the engine problems worsened, and his truck finally came to a stop on the dark, lonely highway. Stranded, Tom reached for his phone to call for a tow but found no signal. As he waited, he noticed strange lights flickering in the distance. They danced in the night, moving in a peculiar pattern that matched the symbols on the receipt. His heart raced as the lights blinked out, leaving him in suffocating darkness. A chill ran down his spine as the sense of being watched settled over him like a heavy blanket. The night dragged on with his engine still silent. Just as dawn broke, a tow truck finally arrived, and Tom was taken to a mechanic. "Have you ever heard of Harper's Haven?" Tom asked, still shaken. The mechanic's face paled and he looked at Tom as if he were crazy. "That place hasn't been operational for years," he replied. "Some say it's haunted. People have seen strange things there. Glowing symbols, eerie figures, and lights that dance in the night." Tom's heart sank as he realized he had stepped into something far darker than he could comprehend. He never returned to Harper's Haven, but the memory of the mysterious receipt and the strange occurrences haunted him. He often wondered if that receipt had been a warning of the sinister forces lurking in the shadows of that forgotten place, waiting for their next visitor. Sarah and Jake were enjoying a road trip across the country, eager for new adventures. But one fateful night, while driving through a desolate stretch of road, their car began to sputter. It was running low on fuel, and just when they were starting to panic, they spotted an old gas station in the distance. The sign, barely visible through the darkness, read Jackson's Fuel. As they pulled in, the station loomed like a ghost from another time, surrounded by weeds and debris. It felt abandoned, but the gas pumps looked functional. With no other options, they decided to stop and refuel. Stepping out of the car, an unsettling silence washed over them. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and a creeping unease settled in their chests. Jake approached the pumps, and as he began to fill the tank, Sarah noticed a strange sound, an almost imperceptible whispering emanating from the gas pumps. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Yeah," Jake replied, glancing around. "It sounds like whispers." The whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a chilling wind. It was a jumble of indistinct murmurs, as if the pumps were trying to communicate something urgent yet incomprehensible. Their unease deepened and they exchanged worried glances. After Jake finished fueling, he wandered into the small, run-down store attached to the station. The door creaked ominously as he entered, and Sarah remained outside, her ears straining to catch the whispers. The store was dark and filled with dusty shelves, remnants of expired products, and an oppressive atmosphere that made her skin crawl. Suddenly, Jake stepped back outside, his face pale as a ghost. "There's no one here," he whispered. "The store is completely empty." Just as they decided to leave, a faint, ghostly voice floated through the air, calling Sarah's name. Heart pounding, she spun around but found only darkness. The whispers intensified, swirling around them like a storm. "Let's go!" she shouted, fear tightening her throat. They hurried back to their car, but as Jake turned the key in the ignition, they froze. The gas station had changed. The pumps were now adorned with strange symbols pulsating with an eerie light, and the sign had morphed into an unreadable jumble of letters. Panic surged through them as they sped away, the whispers echoing in their minds, refusing to let them go. They drove in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, both unnerved by the sense that they had left something behind at Jackson's Fuel. When they finally reached the next town, they couldn't shake off the dread that clung to them. They asked the locals about the gas station, but they received only confused looks. Jackson's Fuel? "That place has been closed for years," one man said, his brow furrowing. "You're not the first to mention strange occurrences there. People say it's haunted." Sarah and Jake exchanged a glance, realizing they had encountered something far more sinister than they ever imagined. They never spoke of their experience again, but the memory of the whispering pumps haunted them, a chilling reminder of the otherworldly presence that lingered in the dark corners of their minds, forever echoing their names. Jake and Emma were on a late-night road trip, their stomachs rumbling with hunger. They spotted a small 24-hour diner glowing invitingly in the darkness. Luna's Eats flickered just off the highway, promising warmth and food, so they pulled in, tired but hopeful. As they approached the drive-thru, the window was lit by a soft, flickering light that seemed to pulse in the night. Jake placed their order, and the voice from the intercom chirped cheerfully, instructing them to wait at the window for their food. But the wait felt unusually long. Sitting in the car, they exchanged worried glances as the diner's sign began to flash erratically. The lights inside flickered as if they were alive, creating a dizzying effect that made Emma's head spin. She squinted at the menu board, which now displayed bizarre, nonsensical items that didn't make any sense. Was that a monster milkshake next to Invisible Burger? Finally, a woman appeared at the drive-thru window, holding a brown paper bag. She smiled warmly, but the dim light cast strange shadows across her face. "Here you go," she said, handing over the bag. Jake thanked her, excitement bubbling up as they drove away. eager to eat. Once back on the road, they reached into the bag, only to find it was empty. Confused and frustrated, they glanced back at the diner, but to their horror, it was gone. The area around them was just an open field, dark and empty, stretching out into nothingness. "Did we just—" Emma started, her voice trailing off as they stared at the spot where the diner had been. "Where did it go?" Jake turned the car around, determined to find the diner again. But as they retraced their route, they found nothing but the unfamiliar stretch of road and the shadows of trees looming around them. Panic set in as they realized the diner had vanished completely, swallowed by the night. After what felt like an eternity of searching, they finally found a gas station and pulled in. The attendant, an older man with weary eyes, looked at them with a mixture of pity and concern. "You saw Luna's eats, didn't you?" he asked, as if he already knew the answer. "Yes," Jake replied, still trying to comprehend what had happened. The attendant sighed, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. "That place closed down years ago. It's said to be haunted. People have reported seeing it appear out of nowhere, only to vanish without a trace." Jake and Emma exchanged horrified looks, the weight of their experience crashing down on them. The story of the ghostly drive-through, once just a local legend, was now their chilling reality. As they drove away, the memory of the empty food bag and the disappearing diner haunted them, a terrifying reminder of what they had encountered in the dark. They never spoke of that night again, but the unsettling question lingered in their minds. What else might be lurking in the shadows waiting to draw them in? It was a scorching summer day when Greg, a traveling salesman, found himself on a long, empty stretch of highway. His car's air conditioning had failed, and sweat dripped down his face. Just as he began to feel the heat closing in, he spotted a rest stop in the distance, a small building with a faded sign reading Greenwood Rest Stop. Relief washed over him as he pulled in, but the moment he stepped out, unease settled in. The rest stop looked abandoned. The parking lot was overgrown with weeds, and the building was in disrepair. Still desperate for a break from the heat, Greg pushed the door open, finding it slightly ajar. Inside, dust hung in the air like a thick fog, and forgotten supplies cluttered the corners. A musty smell hit him as he stepped into the cafe area. Greg noticed the counter, but was surprised to see no one around. "Hello," he called, but only silence answered. Feeling foolish, he walked to the counter and found a rusty old bell. He rang it, hoping to attract someone's attention. After what felt like an eternity, a middle-aged woman emerged from a back room. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothes that seemed out of place, and her eyes looked vacant, as if she were lost in another time. "Can I get something cold to drink?" he asked, trying to keep the conversation light. The woman nodded slowly and vanished back into the shadows. The silence grew heavier. The only sounds were the creaking of the building and a fluttering piece of paper. After a moment, she returned, holding a cold drink. Without a word, she placed it in Greg's hand and turned to disappear into the darkness once more. He tried to thank her, but she didn't acknowledge him. As he sipped the drink, Greg noticed the light outside fading. The temperature in the rest stop plummeted, sending chills down his spine. Shadows crept in from every corner, and he could have sworn the walls were closing in around him. The once familiar rest stop now felt like a tomb. Determined to leave, Greg approached the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged as he pulled and pushed against it, but it felt as if the door was glued shut. The unsettling silence deepened, and the shadows stretched, swirling around him like restless spirits. Suddenly the woman appeared again, this time at the counter. Her ghostly face was twisted in sorrow, her lips moving as if trying to speak, but no sound came out, only a faint whisper that made Greg's skin crawl. "Let me out!" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. In a desperate surge of strength, he shoved against the door one last time and finally forced it open. He stumbled outside, gasping for air. The rest stop had transformed into a crumbling ruin, barely recognizable. The area around it was deserted, and the once welcoming sign was now just a faded memory. Greg's heart raced as he jumped into his car, desperate to escape. He drove away quickly, glancing back at the rest stop. He later learned that the Greenwood rest stop had been closed and abandoned for years, a ghostly relic of the past. The memory of the woman and the decaying rest stop haunted him, a chilling reminder of the eerie encounter that blurred the line between reality and the supernatural. And deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman had been trying to warn him about something dark lurking in the shadows. Tom's Station stood alone on the outskirts of a quiet town, known for its charming old-fashioned decor and friendly service. But behind its quaint exterior lay a secret that sent shivers down the spines of locals, a haunting that had plagued the station for years. One night, a young couple, Lisa and Mark, found themselves driving through the area. Their car was low on fuel, and they decided to stop at Tom's Station, thinking it would be a quick pit stop. As they pulled in, the gas station looked as quaint as ever, its vintage pumps glowing softly under the night sky. While Mark filled up the tank, Lisa ventured inside to pay. But the moment she crossed the threshold, an uneasy feeling settled in her stomach. The store was dimly lit, with old memorabilia casting eerie shadows. She approached the counter, where an elderly man in a classic gas station uniform stood, his face expressionless. "Good evening," Lisa said, forcing a smile. "How much do I owe?" The man looked at her blankly, then handed her a handwritten receipt. Lisa's heart raced when she noticed there was no amount listed, only a cryptic message: "Beware the shadows." A shiver ran down her spine, but she brushed it off as a quirky joke. She paid for the gas and returned to the car, eager to leave. Mark was already inside, and they set off, eager to continue their journey. As they drove, an unnatural darkness enveloped the road. Shadows twisted and shifted in the periphery, making the air feel thick and oppressive. Despite their efforts to dismiss the tension, it clung to them like a second skin. Then, without warning, their headlights flickered. A figure appeared on the side of the road, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face obscured by a veil. She stood there for a fleeting moment before melting back into the darkness. Panic surged through Lisa and Mark, and they slammed on the gas. The shadows seemed to cling to their car as they sped away, whispering of an unseen presence. They finally reached a small motel, desperate for safety. As they settled into their room, unease washed over them, and the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. The next morning still rattled. Lisa and Mark asked the motel clerk about Tom's Station. The clerk's face went pale as she listened to their story. "Tom's Station has been closed for years," she said, her voice trembling. "There were rumors of strange occurrences and sightings. Some say it's haunted by a woman who vanished there long ago." Lisa and Mark exchanged horrified glances, the realization hitting them like a punch to the gut. They had encountered something far beyond a simple gas station. They had brushed against a ghostly legend. From that day on, they never returned to Tom's station. But the chilling memory of that night haunted them. The cryptic warning on the receipt became a dark reminder of the shadows that lurked just beyond the light. A warning they would never forget. In a remote area on the outskirts of town, a small gas station named Ellis's Corner sat in silence, its quirky charm beloved by locals. But on a frigid winter night, it would become the backdrop of a terrifying encounter. Rick, a long-haul trucker, pulled in to refuel, his breath visible in the icy air. The station was eerily quiet, the dim lights flickering overhead. Mr. Ellis, the elderly owner, greeted him with a warm smile as Rick began filling up his truck. As Rick waited, he sensed something odd about the atmosphere. Old photographs and antiques adorned the walls, casting shadows that danced in the flickering light. A faint, rhythmic humming echoed from the back room, almost like a heartbeat. "What's that noise?" Rick asked, curiosity getting the better of him. Mr. Ellis's smile faltered for a moment. "Oh, that's just the old heater," he replied, though the sound felt far too mechanical to be mere heating. After finishing up, Rick stepped inside to pay. The store was filled with vintage decor, but there were no other customers. Yet it felt bustling, as if people had just left. Something about it unsettled him. As he turned to leave, Rick noticed a woman standing outside, dressed in an old-fashioned coat and hat, her gaze fixed on the ground. He waved, but she didn't respond. Shrugging it off, he returned to his truck. But when he glanced back, the woman was walking toward the station. "Hey! Are you lost?" he shouted, but she vanished inside as if swallowed by the shadows. Feeling a surge of unease, Rick went back inside. The station was empty. Mr. Ellis had disappeared. Confused, he scanned the walls again, and the photographs caught his eye. Each one featured people with a haunting similarity, a mix of sadness and resignation etched on their faces. The humming grew louder, pulsing in the back of his mind. Panic flared within him. He had to leave. Rick rushed to his truck and drove away, but as he continued down the road, he saw the woman again, standing on the roadside. This time she was staring directly at him, her pale face void of emotion. Heart racing, he sped past her, not stopping until he reached a truck stop miles away. Breathless, he asked the locals about Ellis's Corner. They exchanged confused glances before one finally spoke up. "That place has been closed for years. Everyone knows about the phantom customer who appears there and vanishes without a trace." Rick's stomach dropped. The chilling encounter echoed in his mind. He had brushed with something otherworldly, something that should not have existed. From that night on, Rick never returned to Ellis's Corner, but the memory of the woman, the strange humming noise, and the sorrowful photographs haunted him. It served as a chilling reminder of the ghostly presence lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to arrive. Jake and Lisa were miles into their cross-country road trip when the engine of their car sputtered and died on a desolate stretch of highway. Stranded without cell service and with the nearest town miles away, they were desperate for help. Just then, they spotted a flickering light in the distance. A small isolated gas station called Bennett's Fuel. As they approached, an unsettling feeling washed over them. The station looked old and run down, with rusty pumps and boarded-up windows. It felt as if the place hadn't seen customers in years. But they had no choice. They needed gas. An elderly man emerged from the shadows as they began refueling. He wore a weathered uniform, his eyes distant and vacant, as if he was staring through them. He nodded in acknowledgement but said nothing, sending a chill down their spines. They exchanged nervous glances but brushed it off as nerves. Once the tank was full, Jake went inside to pay. The interior was cluttered with old equipment and dusty shelves. Behind the counter stood the man, but instead of a cash register, there was a strange antique device that looked like a fuel gauge. Jake handed over a crumpled bill and the man passed him a receipt that made his heart race. It had no total listed, only a cryptic message. The gauge tells all. Confused and uneasy, Jake returned to the car where Lisa was waiting, anxious to leave the eerie place behind. But as they drove off, something strange happened. The fuel gauge began to fluctuate wildly, swinging from empty to full, then back to empty again. Panic set in as the car sputtered and lost power, forcing them to pull over on the side of the road. They were stranded again, with no way to contact anyone for help. As they sat in the darkness, fear gripped them. The night grew colder, and strange lights flickered in the distance, moving erratically as if they were alive. The lights seemed to follow them, casting unsettling shadows around the car. It felt as if they were being watched, trapped in an invisible web of dread. Just when despair threatened to consume them, a passing motorist stopped and offered help. They were towed to the nearest town, where they learned the chilling truth. Bennett's Fuel had been closed for years, abandoned after a series of strange occurrences and ghostly sightings. Jake and Lisa never returned to that stretch of highway, but the memory of the vanishing fuel gauge and the eerie night haunted them. It served as a chilling reminder of their encounter with the supernatural, a night when they learned that sometimes what seems like a simple stop for gas can lead to a terrifying plunge into the unknown. Emily had been driving for hours on a lonely stretch of highway when she spotted Harper's garage in the distance. The small town of Birchwood had once been known for its reliable service and friendly staff, but tonight it felt different. Exhausted and running low on fuel, she pulled in, relieved to see the lights shining brightly against the dark backdrop. As she parked, a wave of unease washed over her. The gas station was unusually quiet. The pumps were functional, but no cars were around. Steeling herself, she walked inside to pay, finding Mr. Harper, the owner, behind the counter. "Good evening," she said, trying to shake off her discomfort. "It's pretty quiet here tonight." Harper smiled faintly, but his eyes held a strange emptiness. He handed her a receipt with no total listed, just the ominous words, "The last call." Confused and a little frightened, Emily pocketed the receipt and hurried back to her car. Just as she started to drive away, the gas station's lights began to flicker, dimming until they cast an eerie, ghostly glow over the lot. As she continued down the road, dread filled her as she noticed her fuel gauge rapidly dropping. How could this be? She had just filled up. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the darkness around her growing thicker with every passing moment. Suddenly her car sputtered and died, leaving her stranded on the side of the highway. Panic surged through her as she tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. Then, from the corner of her eye, she spotted a figure standing in the shadows. Mr. Harper. Her heart raced as she tried to open the door, but before she could move, he vanished into thin air. Panic took hold. She began waving frantically to passing cars, but they sped by without a glance. The temperature dropped, and an unsettling silence enveloped her. Finally, a highway patrol officer arrived, helping her get the car started again. As he worked, he casually mentioned that Harper's garage had been closed for years. Whispers of strange occurrences and ghostly figures surrounded the station, but no one had ever dared to stop there at night. Emily never returned to Harper's garage, but the chilling memory of that night and the cryptic receipt haunted her thoughts. It served as a grim reminder of her close encounter with the supernatural and the warning that sometimes it's better to drive away than to stop for gas. Late one evening, Tim found himself driving through a desolate stretch of highway, the kind where the trees whispered secrets and shadows seemed to stretch for miles. Suddenly, his fuel light flashed ominously. He was running low. Just as panic started to creep in, he spotted a small, dimly lit gas station in the distance. Miller's Fuel, the sign read, but it looked more like a relic from a forgotten time, abandoned and run down. With no other option, Tim pulled in. The station's old pumps groaned as he filled his tank, and the flickering lights cast eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. It felt like a scene from a horror movie. Just then, an elderly woman emerged from the darkness inside the station. Her face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and she silently watched Tim, her gaze piercing through the dim light. Feeling uneasy, Tim finished fueling and walked inside to pay. The air inside was thick and stale, filled with dust and silence. The walls were cluttered with old, forgotten items. The woman stood behind the counter, her eyes still fixed on him. She didn't say a word. Instead, she handed him a receipt with no amount listed, only a chilling message. "The pump knows." A shiver ran down Tim's spine, but he shrugged it off, convinced it was just an odd quirk of the place. He left the station, ready to put the creepy encounter behind him, but as he drove away, his heart sank. The fuel gauge on his car was fluctuating wildly. One moment it showed full, the next it dropped to empty. Tim's car began to sputter, losing power, forcing him to pull over on the side of the road. Frantically, he tried to restart the engine, but nothing worked. As he sat in the dark, unease settled in his stomach. He spotted strange figures moving in the distance, shapes that shifted and blurred, almost as if they were playing tricks on his mind. Finally, after what felt like hours, a passing motorist stopped to help. But when Tim explained his ordeal, the man's face went pale. "Miller's Fuel? That place has been closed for years," he said, shaking his head. "They say it's haunted. People have seen ghostly figures and heard whispers in the night." Tim never returned to that area, but the chilling memory of the woman, the mysterious pump, and the erratic fuel gauge haunted him. Each night, as darkness fell, he would recall that eerie encounter, a haunting reminder of the supernatural forces that lurked in the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler. It was a freezing October night, and Brian was miles away from civilization, his truck running on fumes. The highway stretched on endlessly, dark and empty. His gas gauge hovered dangerously on empty. Just when he thought he might be stranded, he spotted a faint flicker ahead, a gas station, its old neon sign struggling to stay lit. Relief washed over him as he pulled in, but something wasn't right. The station looked ancient, like it had been forgotten long ago. Rusty pumps stood crooked under a faded awning, and the place was eerily quiet. Not a single sound except for the occasional howl of the wind. Brian hesitated, but then started filling up his tank. Out of nowhere, a man appeared. The gas station attendant moved slowly, like he was pushing through something invisible. His uniform was worn, dirty, and his cap sat low, hiding most of his face. "Evening," Brian muttered, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. The attendant barely looked up. "Evening," he replied in a voice that sent a shiver down Brian's spine. As the tank filled, Brian felt eyes on him. He glanced back. The attendant stood there, motionless, staring at him. No emotion, just a blank, almost waiting expression. Brian's pulse quickened. He finished up and walked toward the counter where the attendant now stood, his eyes on an old, dusty ledger. The counter was covered in odd things. Yellowed photos, ancient newspaper clippings, strange trinkets that seemed out of place. "How much do I owe?" Brian asked, uneasy. The man slowly lifted his gaze. "No charge," he rasped, his voice thick with something unspoken. "But be careful." Brian frowned but didn't argue. He hurried back to his truck, trying to ignore the eerie feeling crawling up his skin. As he drove off, he glanced in his mirror. The gas station light flickered, then vanished into the night. A few miles down the road, Brian noticed something strange. His headlights revealed scattered debris, tires, scraps of metal, and clothing. His breath caught in his throat when he saw it. A worn, faded photograph lying among the debris. It was the same family photo he had seen on the counter at the gas station. Heart pounding, Brian slammed his foot on the gas. The road ahead felt like it stretched on forever, the darkness pressing in around him. His phone had no signal, the radio was nothing but static, and the shadows outside seemed to come alive, twisting and moving in the corners of his vision. By morning, Brian learned the truth. The gas station had been shut down for decades. Locals spoke in hushed tones about strange disappearances and ghostly sightings tied to the place. No one had seen an attendant there for years. Brian never stopped at a gas station on a deserted road again. He couldn't shake the feeling that some places, some things, should be left alone forever.